as John Adams' presidency comes to an end with the election of 1800, there is a lot of sort of confusion going on, and sort of what's going to happen with the the outcome of it, right? John Adams loses the popular vote, but then there's how many rounds of voting until ultimately Thomas Jefferson is officially elected. So Jefferson becomes president beginning in 1801, and when he starts his presidency, one of the things that starts to happen is that there needs to be a transition period, right? This is really the first time, or not really the first time, it is the first time in the United States history where there was an election that saw a need to transition power, right? When George Washington left office and John Adams was the sort of chosen successor or the next successor, there wasn't necessarily questions about peaceful transition, but there was here, right? And by the time we get into it, there's really two political parties that have emerged, right? Where George Washington, although he favored federalism, he certainly was, he did not declare to be a member of a party. By the time Jefferson is elected, and certainly within Adams' own term, there was a growing separation of the political party. So the Federalists were pro-British. There's often more frequently from the northern states, and they were very concerned about the sort of unwashed masses, right? The uneducated people. And whereas the Democratic Republicans, they were certainly more in terms of more in favor of the agrarian lifestyle, often more from the South, which would obviously make sense in that respect. But there was a much more fear of a centralized government. And property owning was key to them, right? Where there was less urban environments in the agrarian nature of the South. There was a much more thoughtful piece towards, land ownership being a portion of civic responsibility. So when the election goes on, one of the things that comes up, it's this really dirty campaign, where Jefferson is really slandered for his relationship with Sally Heming. So Sally Heming was a slave that Jefferson had purchased when she was a teenager, and she lived with him in his time as Secretary of State. And by the election of 1800, it's pretty well known that he and she are in a relationship, and that he has had he has had a number of children with her. And this becomes something that is really slandered in the newspapers and the publications, and it is something that he is bashed for. There's also a growing divide within the Federalist Party, partly over the treatment of Jefferson, but also in terms of whether or not the United States should go into war with France, and it's a divide between Hamilton and Adams. Hamilton was this sort of big government person who really wanted to sort of show American dominance on the world stage and their introduction into that. And he wanted to get into a fight with the French. So just before John Adams leaves office and the Federalist Congress leaves office, they create 16 new federal judgeships, and they pass something called the Midnight Judges, which are a whole bunch of Supreme Court justices and other judges that are packed onto the courts. Now, when Jefferson comes in, he denies their ability to take their seat. I'll talk about more of that in a second. The person who's important here is a guy named John Marshall. So John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this time, and John Marshall was put into power by John Adams, and he then becomes the he is the Chief Justice for the next 34 years, which is a huge period. And especially when we think about, today, the Supreme Court meets in one building in Washington, D.C. from October through June. In these days, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the Supreme Court justices went on circuit, and they traveled around the United States, and they went to different parts of the country to issue judgment, right? So it's really interesting that, for 34 years, this is what John Marshall did. Now, when the packing of the court happens, the Federalist Court, because you've had now 2 federal presidents for 3 terms, 12 years, obviously, the Supreme Court at this point was dominated by the Federalists. So Adams tries to pack the court even more to ensure that there's going to be this Federalist nature to it. When Jefferson comes into power, he denies the judges to take their seat. James Madison, as his Secretary of State, does not let them go in. So this guy named William Marbury, he sues for his position and for his salary. And what happens as a result of that, and John Marshall's ruling says that Marbury can't sue, and he also declares that there's this act in the Judiciary Act of 1789 to be unconstitutional because these were laws that were not in the Constitution. The important precedent that comes out of this is that the Supreme Court is given judicial review, that they are allowed, and this is something we still have 220 years later, that the Supreme Court has the authority on the question of constitutionality. So the Constitution can be amended, the Constitution can be changed, the Constitution can be argued over, but the Supreme Court has the final decision. Jefferson's presidency sees a change, the 2 terms that he is president, sees a changing role in what we view as for the presidency. Unlike Adams and certainly unlike Washington, one of the big things that Jefferson does is he changes the role of the military, saving the country some money. So he reduces the power of the standing army to about 2,500 soldiers, which again is really, really small, particularly by today's standards, but certainly then too. And he also does do a little bit to get involved with the Barbary pirates, and the Barbary War is what we're calling it these days. But again, these are sort of small things that occur in terms of the military. Now, the big change that happens in Jefferson's presidency is the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. In 1803, President Jefferson brokers a deal with Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, to purchase the Louisiana Territory. France had acquired the whole territory from Spain when France, the empire, conquered the Spanish kingdom in 1800. Napoleon, and there was a shady treaty that was signed that gave France that territory. Napoleon now, though, by 1803, has had to deal with years of a revolution and civil war and ultimately independence in Haiti, needed money. Napoleon is also waging war all throughout Europe, so they need money. Jefferson purchases the whole territory for $15 million. Now, the big piece of this is that the U.S. gets not just massive amounts of territory, but access to the Mississippi River, and most importantly, access to New Orleans, which now gives them the ability to trade globally with easy access to the Mississippi River. This is a perfect piece of, decision-making by Jefferson, gets a huge swath of land to become part of the United States. It doubles the size, all of it, everything. This cannot be understated. So the impact of this is, as I say, huge. In terms of the size of the country, it doubles it. It gives us more, agricultural area, places to grow to. For people who are concerned about slavery, right, one of the things that happens here is that there is a massive concern about the continuing spread, especially since this is going to be largely agricultural areas. So there becomes a lot of questions here, in terms of, what can, what is going to happen. And there's also the other major question of, whether or not this, domestically, whether this was constitutional. Can the president make such a deal? So James Madison succeeds Thomas Jefferson to the presidency in 1809. And when he comes into the presidency, one of the things that Madison has to contend with is growing problems between the United States and the British. The British are impressing American soldiers, American sailors, Navy members, which is forcing them to serve in the British Army if they are captured. The Madison administration, when he comes into office, says that the British have 3 months to change these orders and stop doing this. So by June, so 3 months into his presidency, by June, Madison asks the Congress to declare war on Britain, and the war, is one that, the War of 1812, as we ultimately come to know of it, is one where the United States is really pushing back on the British and really making sure that people that the British understand, and that is more widely known, that the United States is not going to tolerate sort of being pushed around. Now, the war, we're not going to terribly go into much detail on, but it is important to know, right, that the United States does get as far as invading Canada, and there is a lot of fighting that goes on on the water in the Atlantic Ocean. So one of the things that's important to see here is that the United States gets involved and is doing a lot of work to try and protect its sovereignty. So ultimately, there is a Treaty of Ghent, which is signed in December of 1814, and this is meant to, again, solidify peace between the British and the Americans, and ultimately the impact of this is to reassert America's independence from the British. And again, it has a major boost to American morale and American nationalism. Finally, out of that newfound nationalism, the last piece here is that there is just a huge push towards expressing that American nationalism. You have, the Websters who create the first dictionary. There are textbooks that are writing about American history. Again, and we could talk about, there's obviously Native Americans kept out of that and the biases there, but there's this newfound approach to American history and American nationalism, and that is expressed through the 1820s up until the 1840s.